You've seen it 100 times in movies. The medieval banquet hall glowing with candlelight, tables piled high with roasted meat, golden goblets brimming with wine, laughter echoing beneath vaulted ceilings. But strip away the fantasy, and what's left isn't glory. It's rot. The meat was rancid, the bread was laced with fungus, and every bite could kill you faster than starvation ever could. In the Middle Ages, survival didn't hinge only on finding food. It depended on whether that food would betray you. There were no refrigerators, no freezers, no plastic-wrapped safety nets. Preservation meant salt, smoke, or sheer luck. What sat on your plate was never fresh. It was a gamble. The universal fear wasn't going hungry. It was the quiet dread that your next meal might send you into fever, convulsions, or a slow, rotting death. And yet, people had no choice. Food was scarce, and waste was unthinkable. You ate what you had, whether it was spoiled or not. This is the brutal truth. In the medieval world, dining wasn't about pleasure or even nourishment. It was about survival, rolling the dice with every bite. Spoiled meat, toxic bread, poisoned water, endless hunger. Each meal was a gamble with death. And over the next moments, you'll see exactly how. From rotten meat disguised with spices, to bread that burned your body from the inside out, to banquets of excess and winters of famine, the medieval table was never safe. It was a battlefield where food itself was the deadliest weapon. Let's begin with the meat, rancid, rotting, and deadly, even when dressed as a feast. Picture a cut of meat on a modern kitchen counter. If it sits for more than a few hours, you toss it out. In the Middle Ages, there was no such luxury. Without refrigeration, meat began to spoil almost as soon as the animal was slaughtered. Families tried to stretch its life with salt, smoke, or vinegar, but none of these methods truly stopped decay. At best, they delayed it. At worst, they simply disguised it. This is where the myth of medieval spices begins. Pepper, cloves, cinnamon, imported luxuries that nobles flaunted at their tables. But the truth is darker. These spices didn't enhance flavor, they masked rot. That fragrant stew served in a castle might have been nothing more than rancid beef disguised under layers of spice. Nobles were not feasting on fresh cuts. They were chewing through corruption hidden under expensive seasoning. And then came the leftovers. In taverns, no one wasted a scrap. Meat was boiled and reboiled until it dissolved into a greasy sludge, a broth of fat and bone where freshness had long since died. Every serving carried the risk of foodborne illness, fevers, vomiting, bloody flux that could empty a body in days. The cruel irony is that those who ate the most meat were also in the most danger. Nobles consumed far more animal flesh than peasants, which meant they also consumed more rot, more parasites, more invisible killers with every feast. Abundance itself became a threat. Now compare this to the modern world. Today, we throw away a steak at the first hint of expiration. Back then, discarding meat was unthinkable. You ate it no matter the smell, the slime, or the risk, because survival demanded it. But meat was only half of the danger. The true staple of medieval life wasn't flesh, it was bread. And within those loaves lurked a poison far deadlier than rot: fungus. Bread was the heartbeat of medieval survival. For peasants, it wasn't a side dish, it was the meal. Thick loaves of rye bread made up the bulk of daily calories. But hidden inside this staple lurked a silent killer. Rye stored in damp barns or cellars was the perfect breeding ground for ergot fungus. And once it spread,
Every bite became poison. Ergotism was its name, though people didn't understand it then. At first, it felt like fire under the skin, burning sensations that spread through limbs. Then came the convulsions, the hallucinations, visions of demons and angels as the fungus warped the brain. In its severest form, the blood flow to arms and legs shut down entirely. Flesh blackened, limbs rotted while still attached. Amputation, if you survived long enough, was the only escape. Villages struck by this plague of bread often believed they were cursed by God. They called it St. Anthony's fire, a divine punishment for sins. Entire communities writhed in fever, some screaming, some wandering in delirium, others dying with blackened stumps where their hands and feet once were. The terror wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. To be consumed from within by your own daily bread felt like hell itself had risen from the oven. And yet, there was no choice. Bread was life, even if it carried death in every slice. The irony is brutal. The one food that promised safety from starvation was often the deadliest thing on the table. Today, we toss moldy bread into the trash without hesitation. In the Middle Ages, you didn't throw it away. You ate it, prayed, and hoped the fire wouldn't catch hold inside your body. But bread and meat were only part of the problem. Even the things you drank, the milk, the water, carried dangers just as lethal and sometimes even more deceptive.
Imagine a jug of fresh milk placed on your table today. You know it will last for days in the refrigerator. In the Middle Ages, it spoiled in less than one. By the next sunrise, it had already turned sour, curdled, crawling with bacteria, invisible to the eye, but merciless to the body. That's why milk was rarely drunk raw. Instead, it was transformed into cheese, butter, or curds, anything that could stretch its lifespan just a little further. But milk was nothing compared to water. In towns and villages, rivers and wells doubled as garbage dumps, laundry stations, and most dangerously, toilets. Human and animal waste seeped into the very water people drank. Typhoid, cholera, dysentery, diseases that ripped through intestines and drained bodies until they collapsed, flowed in every cup. A single gulp from a contaminated stream could mean days of agony followed by an early grave. So people turned to an alternative, beer. Not the strong, intoxicating brews you think of today, but a weak ale, barely alcoholic, consumed daily by men, women, and even children. The brewing process, boiling and fermenting, killed much of what would have made water deadly. It wasn't about intoxication, it was about survival. The irony is striking. The safest drink for a 6-year-old medieval child wasn't water, it was beer. Meanwhile, the wealthy imported wine, but even that wasn't immune to souring. Casks could spoil, leaving a rancid liquid only made palatable with spices or honey. Freshness was a myth. Everything you consumed carried a risk. Today we agonize over organic labels, filtered water, and expiration dates. But for a medieval peasant, the only rule of survival was simple: don't die from your drink. And yet while nobles drowned in excess and peasants clung to scraps, both faced another cruel truth. Feasting and famine often lived side by side. The medieval table was a stage of extremes. At one end, nobles gorged themselves in halls glittering with candlelight. Whole roasted boars, spiced pies, peacocks with feathers reattached for show. These banquets dazzled with abundance. Guests stuffed themselves to the point of vomiting, then returned to the feast as if gluttony itself were a sport. Yet all this excess carried a hidden curse. The more exotic and perishable the food, the higher the risk of poisoning. A noble's feast could end with dysentery or worse, a banquet that killed more than it entertained. Meanwhile, outside the castle walls, peasants scraped by on thin gruel and scraps. In harsh winters, their world collapsed into the hungry months,
when barns were empty and fields frozen solid. Survival meant gnawing on bark, grinding acorns into bitter flour, or boiling animal bones for one last trace of fat. Famine was not rare. It was expected. Every harvest carried the shadow of starvation. The psychological toll was relentless. Families lived with the constant fear that one bad season, one failed crop, would mean death for their children. And sometimes, desperation drove people to unthinkable acts. Chroniclers record stories of parents abandoning children to save food for the rest of the family, villages whispering of cannibalism in the darkest years of famine. The metaphor is stark. In the medieval world, a table could be a coffin of excess or a desert of emptiness. To feast meant risking death by indulgence. To starve meant wasting away in silence. Either way, food was never safe. And that brings us to the cruelest truth of all. In the medieval world, every bite, every swallow, every crumb carried risk. Eating itself was a gamble with death.
Meat rotting on the table, bread laced with fungus, milk curdling overnight, water steeped in filth, and the constant shadow of famine. This was the daily menu of the Middle Ages. Every meal was a wager, every bite a roll of the dice. Survival was never guaranteed, not by abundance, not by scarcity, not by faith. The universal fear was simple, that what should sustain you might instead betray you. A loaf of bread could burn you alive from within. A sip of water could hollow you out in days. A winter with empty barns could silence entire villages. To eat in the medieval world was to face death dressed as dinner. Forget the myth of majestic banquets. Beneath the candles and music lay rancid meat masked with spice, and cups of ale brewed to fight back poisoned rivers. For peasants, the table wasn't a place of comfort. It was a battlefield of hunger, rot, and desperation. And now, look at your own world. Refrigeration hums quietly in your kitchen. Clean water flows clear from a tap. Food safety laws guard against poisons that once went unnoticed. You throw away what looks spoiled. They consumed it because they had no choice. That's the brutal truth. In the Middle Ages, the deadliest weapon wasn't forged in iron. It was served on a plate. So the next time you sit down to a meal, remember, your worst leftovers today would have been a miracle. And in the medieval world, your dinner might have been your last.